This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflections and hope for progress in education. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
Good morning, Australian time. Good evening, North American time. My name is Judyth Sachs, and I'm the Chief Academic Officer of Studiosity, a role that I've had for 7 years. It gives me great pleasure to introduce two commentators and participants of our higher education. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, but we've got Goldie Blumenstyk and Noreen Golfman from Canada. So Goldie, why don't you tell us a bit about your story, about how you got engaged with higher education and really some of the things that you've observed, particularly over the past 5 years.
Okay, thanks, Judyth. Thanks for having me on here today. I'm Goldie Blumenstyk, as Judyth said. I was a longtime reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. I retired just about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, after more than 36 years at the Chronicle, just sort of shocking for me to think about. And 8 years before that at the Orlando Sentinel in Florida, not covering education particularly. At the Chronicle, I covered, everything. I covered frankly, everything but education. I covered business, I covered politics, I covered technology, I covered sort of the innovation space, I covered, and sort of various technology transfer, the way universities commercialize research, and also really the for-profit higher education sector, which was kind of had the boom and the bust in higher education space in the States while I was reporting on it. For the last 6 years at the Chronicle, I wrote kind of switched gears a little bit, and I wrote this weekly newsletter, eventually became a bi-weekly newsletter called The Edge, which was about innovation in and around higher education. That was no accident because actually I was always kind of interested in those liminal spaces in higher ed, the spaces between the traditional colleges and kind of the business community, the economic development community, the industry company, the companies that were, trying to sell to higher ed. And so The Edge was a little bit almost like perfect culmination for all those experiences over the years, because it was about not just the innovation that colleges were doing, but the innovations that were coming from private companies, innovations that were coming from, foundation groups or from other sort of interest groups in higher education. I would say, just a sort of a retrospective as I think back on my career, which I've had a chance to do a lot of in the last few months. I don't want to go on and on, but I started at the Chronicle. For the first 4 years of the Chronicle, I covered state politics, which I think is relevant to this conversation because in the United States, we have obviously, one nation. We don't really have a system of higher education. We have at least 50 systems of higher education, and probably more than that if you figure out where the community colleges all fit in. And for me, it was just this most fascinating way to begin to understand American higher education by covering state politics and covering sort of state politics through the lens of higher education. And, education in Florida, even then, was very different than education in Oregon. And it was a great way to sort of begin to understand really the complexity of the American higher education. I call it an enterprise, not so much as a system. I'm not so sure enterprise is the best word either, but yeah, so that's the basic.
So what about your own education? Where did you go to university?
I'm from New Jersey. You get a little Jersey girl out of me still now and then. I went to college in upstate New York at a small liberal arts college called Colgate University. At the time, about 2,500 students. And then I went immediately afterwards to Columbia School of Journalism. I got a graduate degree in journalism. I don't necessarily recommend going right from undergrad college to journalism school. I think that was not the best opportunity, but it's the way I took it. And then I went to work immediately after that in Orlando, Florida for 8 years, covering local development, zoning, I was Orlando City Hall reporter for about 4 or 5 years. Well, I guess 4 years or so, covering kind of local politics. And then I just kind of wanted to make a shift. And I wanted to be a national reporter. I wanted to cover issues I think local news is like still so vitally important in our country and all countries. But I wanted sort of the opportunity to cover things from a national perspective. And in the same way that and covering national politics covering states through the lens of higher education was amazing. Covering just thinking about higher education as this lens, it was a great way to do that.
Thank you. We'll dig into some of those things more throughout the conversation. Noreen, my long-standing academic advisory board fellow, but also a fellow former provost.
Listening to Goldie, I was thinking, journalism was not ever an active part of my profile, but a kind of indirect effect of being somebody who was interested in how systems work. And as an academic, perhaps not surprisingly, I found myself eventually moving, not so much by accident. I wasn't pushed. I kind of jumped a little into senior leadership because I was interested in the bigger picture, in making how did change happen and how could you affect change. And I think there was something of the gene of curiosity or of a kind of a journalistic instinct in me, because I did end up working for our national broadcaster while I was an academic for about 6 years as a freelance broadcaster, doing lots of commentary on local political issues of the day. And I live in a small province where if you do that and you're on television in those days, pre-digital, 2 nights a week, you become a kind of, I hesitate to say public intellectual, but public figure.
Figures, yeah.
Definitely. And I sort of sought a career that married my interest in systems and in progressive change to commentary with the public broadcaster. It was, again, I kind of fell into it, but maybe that was my sort of, direction my whole life was taking. Right from the get-go as an undergrad growing up in Montreal, a very kind of heavy political environment in the 70s.
And still today, actually. What was your discipline?
My discipline was English, but I ended up, not surprisingly, for film studies and media and cultural studies students and scholars, it came out of English departments, that whole field, a kind of, area studies in that crossover between, narratology and film scholarship and cultural studies and media studies in a kind of post-Marshall McLuhan environment, particularly in Canada. And I was lucky enough to have been born in Montreal, so I could go to McGill, where all of that conversation was happening in the 70s. And it was, incredibly formative for me.
He was Canadian, right? Marshall McLuhan?
Yeah, through and through. Although I did work, my first tenure track job was at the University of Maine in Orono, as we used to say, colon in the middle of nowhere. But I had a great year, but I did long to come back to Canada after even that year as a tenured faculty member, because I was afraid of losing that connection to what I really valued about the Canadian, just Canadian culture in all its diversity, and what I saw as a more generally liberal, democratic, progressive cultural reality than the one that I was increasingly aware of living even in Maine. So I've had a really interesting career. I'm retired a few years, but still obviously active with the Studiosity board and various higher education enterprises, and being asked to speak at various conferences. In fact, there's one coming up next year that I'm invited to speak at as a party of on a panel. I think the theme is tentatively called Angry Provosts. So that I'm thinking, that's not such a bad brand to have these days. It's better than totally complicit, passive, leading from the top provost. So there you go.
Or oh my God, what's coming at me next, provosts? Yeah.
Right.
Or in fact, even co-opted provosts.
Yes. Well, that's practically redundant these days.
It's part of the job.
Yeah.
So when you reflect on your career, what's your overall sort of description of you as an educator and a higher educator?
You know, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer, but when I do reflect, I think in the early days when I was not an administrator, I was trying to get tenure and then got tenure and then working through the promotion hierarchy, doing my scholarship and doing whatever it takes. I used to call it Gidget gets a career in higher ed. Um, I was quickly branded, it became increasingly clear to me as a kind of troublemaker. Somebody actually described me as that. I didn't know whether to be offended or flattered. And I'm still ambivalent about that because I think there was a lot of sort of sexist labeling that was going on, probably still does, of course, at the time about that. You know, women who speak up at meetings, women who are, a kind of challenge maker, as somebody called, identified it to me more recently. And I think my shift into administration versus an associate dean, then a dean, and then eventually vice president and provost, it tempers a lot of that. So people did see me as a champion of, let's call it, anti-corporatism or whatever, however the winds were shifting or deemed to be in higher ed over the last 20 or so years. But when you occupy those roles, as I'm sure you very well know, it's very easy to have that turn on you and for people to say they're disappointed in you. I'm overstating to some extent the experience of being in that role, but only because it's something I reflect on a lot about how do people transition from being an academic scholar, sort of mainstreaming their careers into being in a much more prominent leadership position as times get more difficult, as budgets shrink, as the culture of leadership makes demands on you that you didn't sign up for.
And what about role models? I think for both of you, there were probably not as many female role models in academic leadership. I mean, I don't know, maybe you guys were more advanced than in the States, but I feel like in the States, when I was coming in, I mean, I think there's many women who are running higher ed now, but that's over the course of 36 years, I've seen that change a lot. There weren't
Yeah.
nearly as many when I started.
Yeah, I'd agree. Judyth, wasn't it the same for you or something similar?
Oh, absolutely. And my first professorial appointment was actually as a professor of education at the University of Sydney. And in 1996, I was the first woman professor, full professor, appointed at the University of Sydney. So in a highly feminized profession, for 1996 being the first woman. And then my issue was I didn't, and I was young, so I was 41 when I got that job. So I had no role models. The women professors that were in, senior positions in Australian universities were sort of traditional meritocratic battle axes. And here I was young. And until I actually gave myself permission to be Judyth, I thought, what have I done coming to Sydney? And once I gave myself permission to be Judyth, which was, irreverent, smart, but irreverent, I just felt as though I had this oppressive mantle. So, yeah, I think that now there are more women professors. In fact, there are a lot more women professors, and there are more women vice chancellors in Australia. But at its peak, it's probably of the 41 universities in Australia, it's about 10 women vice chancellors. At the most, the rest are men.
Yeah. Yeah. Same here.
I don't think it's 25% female presidents in the United States, though. So you're still, I mean, bigger N. We have a bigger N here, but
Yeah, it's been astonishingly slow to change. And I wonder too the degree to which women say, why do I want to do that? Why do I want to, I've got my career, I've got my life, and it's a very good question. It's not one I ever asked. I sort of, as I say, jumped into it, but I understand now looking at it that women who are in their disciplines and doing their work and managing their lives would say, I don't see any joy in that.
So did you plan your career, or you just thought, that looks interesting, I'll do that.
Oh yeah, geez, planning was like, I think that one big difference, this is arguable, between perhaps today's younger scholars and leaders is that they might be much more conscientious or thoughtful or strategic about their careers. Whereas to some degree, I had the privilege growing up in Montreal, being at McGill at a certain cultural moment where the intensity of the pressure of joining a job market was really not so, I mean, we were kind of conscious of it, but not in quite the same way that I think students are now, understandably. And so planning was not, in fact, we were sort of anti-planners. The notion was to kind of balance the predictability of your job or your career or scholarly aspiration against the unpredictability or the freedom of, taking whatever path would come your way. I'm not so sure that, again, that's a privilege afforded to many people today who probably don't think of it in quite the same way.
Goldie, did you plan your career?
I definitely planned to be a journalist. I knew right from the start, that right after college, that it seemed to be the right career because I was interested in public policy. I liked to write. I liked, so I felt like, oh, I don't have to, be I'm not going to necessarily be in politics, but I can like follow politics, and I can also have kind of a creative way to do it. And I like covering local government. I never expected to be a I didn't really know that you could be a higher education journalist. It never even occurred to me. I basically took the job at the Chronicle in 1988 because I got the job. It wasn't, I was in Florida and I wanted to leave Florida, and I got a job in Washington. I was like, oh, this is good. And I went to the Chronicle, and I've said that to the folks there. So it's not, surprised, but I thought it was kind of a stodgy place. And I wasn't really sure I was going to stick around there very long because it just seemed like, I don't know. But it turns out that the Chronicle was a really great place to work. And as I said, the field itself was just suddenly, it was amazing. Through that lens, you could just cover, as I said, economic development, business. I remember coming back to seeing my friends in Florida like 6 or 8 months afterwards, not very long afterwards. And I was just telling them a couple of stories that I had done. And one of my friends said to me, wow, he said, you went from a general newspaper to a specialty paper, but you're just covering this incredibly wide range of issues now that you never covered nearly that wide range of issues when you were here at the general newspaper. And I was like, he was right. And I was like, oh, I knew that at the time, but it was having it nicely crystallized to me by that comment. And at that moment, the combination of the subject matter and also just a nice place to work just said, you know what, I don't really need to go looking that hard for something else. I don't think there's going to be too many other jobs that are going to let me travel around the country, talk to really interesting people, get this sort of, deal with this sort of, this sort of clash of culture that you get when you're talking about academics and politics and business and economics and technology. It just seemed like such a great way to sort of, learn about the world. And I learned I know a lot of things about the world because I covered higher education. It's just it's a funny thing, but the number of things that you touch on. I know about intellectual property now. I know a lot about economic development. I know a lot about, regional. I know about how states fight. I know all about IT. I don't know that much about AI, but I know because I sort of cut short. I haven't done that, but I learned all about, I was like sort of in the throes of the internet when the internet was happening. We were, because higher ed was kind of on the cutting edge of that at the time. So completely unplanned, but like what a phenomenal break I had by making that the choice that I made in 1988.
No kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, honestly, I should say a particularly good time in journalism, and particularly a better time in trade journalism, because it was still kind of a strong day within 10 years, local news was already starting to suffer financially as the internet came in, but the Chronicle made some pretty smart choices then too. And we were, I still say a trade paper. So we had sort of some niche. So I also was managed to be there at some very good times for journalism as well.
Goldie made the comment about the Chronicle being a great place to work. Do you reckon that we could say that about universities as being great places to work, Noreen?
I feel very loyal to all the universities I've either been educated at or worked at, and that even includes the University of Maine, where I was for a year, and where I made very good friends with whom I'm close to this day. So in that sense, it's about the, relationships you build, the allies, if you're trying to make change, but certainly, um, that's it's like attracts like. You find people with whom you can share a meal and a conversation that grows over time, becomes part of your intimate reality, and that's certainly true for me. One of the reasons, among many, why I wouldn't move back to the mainland from an island where I live, and on the furthermost eastern coast of Canada, is because of that world of all those people, including my staff, and with whom I stay very close and have drinks every 5 weeks and gossip our brains out about how horrible everything is at the university. But we share, a kind of formation of identity and change and commitment. And I'm somebody who has always thrived on those kinds of, on that relational gift, I think, that the academic world offers. Not everybody takes advantage of it.
Mm.
Academics are by and large introverts. I'm not, but
Really?
yeah, okay, no need for that. Um, I don't think any of us here would qualify, but loyal to, to the world that it gave me. I mean, we're talking about some abstract institutional body, but it's about the people who comprise it, who who change your life and affect your life, and why your relationships can deepen through those experiences.
I mean, it does seem at their best, which they're not always at their best, but at their best, colleges or universities, they are still basically, they are mission driven, and the mission is a positive mission for students, for society. So I would think that would be useful. And I know certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, it's gotten a lot harder to work at a university. I mean, even before COVID, but certainly COVID, and then a lot of the economic challenges that are coming towards colleges, much less the political ones that we have here in the States. It's not that all that's gotten just a lot harder. I mean, I feel like when I've reported on universities over the years, I feel like they've become, I think you talked a little bit about them becoming corporatized. I think they've become so much more bureaucratic over the last 20 to 30, 20 to 30 years. I mean, it used to be just like a dream come true as a reporter. You'd call up a university and you'd talk to professors and, free, academic freedom, and people would tell you what they thought, and you'd get a real good sense, I think, of what the issues were and what the challenges were and where the points of conflict were. And then over time, it all kind of got a lot more bureaucratized, and it got a lot harder to kind of, I mean, the challenges and those issues were still there, but they were a little more hidden, and a little harder to ferret out, because people were just getting a lot more cautious about what they could say, when they could say it, how they could say it. The stakes kept getting sort of, or people thought, I think it's a mistake, frankly. I feel like higher ed was maybe better regarded, at least in the States where I know it best, when it felt more authentic and a little less sort of corporatized and bureaucratized. But it's certainly, that's been one of the trajectories. So, but I still think at the core, when people can like throw that other junk out of the way, I feel like the people who, wake up every day and say, I'm here to help educate students, I'm here to, add benefit to society, I think those people are still feeling pretty good about their work. It's just that they have to fend off all this other, financial stresses and bureaucratic things and a lot of other, political agendas and other stuff coming at them at the same time.
Can I pick up on a point that Noreen made about relationships in universities? And when I was thinking about two universities I spent a lot of time in, University of Sydney and Macquarie. And I remember walking across the campus at Sydney University, and I would say hello to lots and lots of people. And I thought, it's like living in a big country town. And so that sense of community is actually, for me, that represents what you were saying. And that sense of, if you are belonging and you feel that you are part of, particularly leading the direction of the university, it's an extraordinary privilege to be in senior management roles to do that. but also to go to the joyous occasions of graduations. At Macquarie at graduations, we had all the graduates stand up, turn around, and just give a round of applause and appreciation to all the people that helped them. And even though I probably went to about 150 graduations while I was at Macquarie, each time it gave me a lump in the throat. And it's just those simple symbolic aspects of that community, of that sort of sets of relationships, I think, that hold us together in universities, despite the travails, despite the sort of the politicization of higher education. And I think that's why people stay there. What do you think about that, Noreen? And then Goldie, from your broader national perspective of the US, is that pretty much the same as well? So Noreen?
I agree with you 100%. I've had those same experiences, particularly at graduation. But yes, it is a community. It's often not thought of about in that way. Maybe it used to be. I mean, the whole advancement development offices of universities have in mind the experience that people have had of that community in order to secure their commitment long term for sustaining their scholarship funds and their endowments. And so there's obviously a great deal to be said about that. But that gets kind of lost, especially these days, in all the noise around universities and the noise aiming at universities for underserving their communities. I mean, the negativity is, Goldie, you'd probably be right at that coalface, pretty demoralizing.
It's pretty negative over here right now.
Yeah, it's not so negative here, but I mean, it's hard to avoid, particularly as governments and, funding agencies feel kind of under siege about accountability, however they rationalize that, the pressure to be tied more closely for colleges and universities to the labor market, however that might be defined in terms of, success or potential. So, there is a lot of pressure. And that story about the value of universities is something I think people who go to university, largely having a good experience, and those who work there understand. But it's largely lost in general. And I think that loss, if you will, or lack, has something to do with the dominant negativity that's happening. I mean, often we will say here in Canada, how is it that our government ministers or department heads in various bureaucratic offices who've graduated from our universities are turning against them the way they are? Like, what sort of dissonance is going on there that they have somehow occluded the relationship that formed them? I'm not sure I have an answer to that question, but it's a common phenomenon.
Yeah.
And the success is dependent on or founded on having gone to university and been successful at university and grown up through being at uni.
Social mobility, you put them where they were. That's what universities gave them,
It's a question I've been wondering right now, specifically on the community question. I mean, at least in Australia, it's not as residential though in Australia, right? Institutions, students don't necessarily live on the campus. In the States, students, at least for the first year or so, in many public colleges, four-year colleges, students live on campus. And I know at McGill, I was there 2 summers ago. There were nice dorms there. It's beautiful, by the way. But so I think it's like a little bit different here. They work a little harder in the States here to try to develop that community notion. But the thing that you're just saying about like the dislike for higher education right now, I'm kind of baffled, but I guess there's sort of two separate strains of this. On the one hand, in the United States, like 30% of Americans have a bachelor's degree. So obviously that's a lot of, I can't do the quick math on that, but that's a lot of people. That's several, tens of millions of people in the States who are successful, who had a bachelor's degree and had a good experience. We also have some 40 million folks in the United States who have some college and no degree, and in many cases, some debt to go along with that. And so I think that's a little bit where some of the dissonance comes in for the, for the students thinking about that. They didn't get that great experience at the end of the pipeline. They didn't get to be at the graduation. They didn't make it to the graduation to have their work celebrated, to have their families around them, to feel that they had made that accomplishment. They got frustrated along the way or couldn't afford it or had to do something else and had to leave. And so that's, I think there is, for them, it's hard for them to sort of see how the equation works out quite as well. Although I do think there are millions more in the States that have a degree and are successful as a result of it.
Mm-hmm.
But we do have a big population that's very frustrated right now.
Right.
Can I just divert the conversation slightly? And Goldie, with your extensive experience in Pan-American, not like the airline, but cross-America gaze, and those filters that you talked about, are there any particular stories that stand out for you as being really a turning point in higher education, or sort of such major import that you've remembered them and that in fact people learned from your reporting?
I mean, some of my favorite stories weren't necessarily the most consequential ones, honestly. Some of the ones were more about sort of the little cultural moments in higher education that you could, I wrote about ice cream, colleges with creameries, and just sort of like some of the goofy stuff that happens on campuses that's just so lovely and quirky and wonderful about American higher education. I'm trying to think a little bit. I wrote a lot about costs, the college cost conundrum. And sort of the complexities of that. The stories that I sort of dug the deepest on, honestly, are some of the ones that I wrote about the technology transfer stuff. And I don't know how much people learned from that at the time, but I learned a little bit about some of the ways that colleges could be not quite two-faced, but colleges there'd be a lot of conflict over like the fate of a research development and kind of where the money was going to flow and who was going to benefit from that. And I always thought those were sort of interesting because at those moments, colleges were acting more like businesses than they were than they were as being, sort of public service mission institutions. And I felt like that's where some of the value, there were a lot of conflicts of values along the way. And then I guess in the last few years, I wrote a lot about, and this is, I feel like, actually the last couple of years, the Chronicle also started to do these sort of in-depth reports, which were kind of like super long stories. And I wrote a lot about adult students and the ways higher education in America was not well designed yet for the older student. I mean, obviously most college students are technically adults, but for the students older, say, than the traditional age, older than 24. And I feel like that, for me, that was some of the most gratifying work that I did because it was good reporting, talking about the challenges that older students faced, the ways colleges could make themselves more adaptable, and unfortunately, the structural barriers that were standing in their way that were making it hard for them to actually, make what seemed to be obvious, steps. But it's a hidebound area, and there's a lot of tradition in American education. There's a lot of it's very hard it's a very big enterprise, and it doesn't move on a dime very well. And so there's a lot of stuff you have to chip away to make change in higher education. So I think I enjoyed writing about those areas where change was starting to happen a little bit, and where there were a few outlying institutions that were kind of setting the bar ahead of, not even the most famous ones, some of the more thoughtful community colleges and a few of the other schools that were just very focused on adult students. I continue to actually consider that one of the bigger issues that I care about a lot.
One of the things that you talked about, and you went to a small liberal arts college yourself, is in many of these communities, the community is the college or university, and the university is the community. And if you have a major sort of economic failure in the college, that has profound impacts on the community. Are you seeing more and more of that? Because I've been reading about, long-standing liberal arts colleges that have fantastic histories. Their margins must be so tight, and it's challenging.
Oh, it's actually, there are parts of the country, we talk a lot right now about the demographic cliff that's hitting the country. And I mean, there are parts of the upstate New York where I went to school, in Ohio, in Michigan, where small colleges that were, kind of the major employer in the town, they're folded. And then the town almost kind of folds up with it. I mean, it doesn't fold up with it, but the town really suffers as a result. My college is actually doing very well with, competitiveness, and it's got a lot of, it's got a lot of alumni who are not journalists. So a lot of alumni who can donate very well to the school. So it's doing very well, but there's a lot of other schools that I remember, hearing about when I was going to school that they're not there anymore. Just in other right in the region of upstate New York where we lived, where our school was. So it's, I think America, I mean, there's this, one of the last things I wrote for the Chronicle was a report called 2035, Higher Ed in 2035. And in it, I sort of talked about how this expansionist era of American higher education was over. I couldn't exactly pinpoint when the expansionist era started, because I guess it depends on when you count. Was it like the late 60s? Was it sort of the 80s? Whatever, but whenever it was, it's over now. I mean, higher education is in a contraction mode in the States.
For sure.
In some key ways. I mean, there's still millions of people who want to go to college. There's still millions of people who need to go to college. But I just think the number of institutions that we have is going to, and the way that they operate is going to have to change quite a bit.
Noreen, what about Canada? Because I imagine Memorial University was a major employer in the town where you're located.
Yeah, and we are in the capital city. Our main campus is in the capital of the province. So government is the first employer, employs the largest number of people, and the university second. So everything that affects the university affects the, the verbs through the whole community here, in fact, through the whole province. Everybody's got a spotlight on the university for good and bad. That every little change or major change, we now have an incoming president. I don't envy the spotlight that's on her, but there's a lot of attention to and a lot of conversation about, things need to change, the university needs to shrink. There's a lot of that, lots of assumptions about behind that kind of a statement. What does that mean when you're employing so many thousands of people who are servicing your economy and your, social cohesion? But those questions don't get asked. As we all know, the questions that get asked or they don't get asked. The questions that are muted are the most important ones. Instead, what grabs the headlines or what grabs the kind of chattering class's attention is, big or small, growing too big for itself, overspending, bloated administration, the kind of cliches of critique about higher education that are pretty universal. And we're no different. Even while, if there are surveys done about, citizens' approval rate of the university, they're very, very, very high. So, 85% of people in the region believe the university should be well funded and should continue, and tuition should be lower. But there are so many contradictions that play out because of people's fear of the economy, because of the sort of dark clouds that hang over everything in geopolitics these days that affect everybody, including us, because of tariffs, because of our slow, unpleasant divorce from the United States, on whom we've been so dependent. I mean, there's so much happening in that environment. Universities get caught in the swirl of conversations about where public funding in particular should be spent, where it should be disseminated. So everybody's feeling quite vulnerable. What irritates me probably the most is the assumptions about size, as Goldie alluded to, about shrinkage, and what's the basis of all that. I understand the growth in the 60s through the 80s based on demographics, the boomers. There were apparently more people interested in going into higher education and being served by it. But that whole immigration piece that's been central to the growth of Canadian universities here is now being challenged rather severely.
Hello. Yeah, here too.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, registration is down. Canadian government itself, unfortunately, even a Liberal government, has started to put caps on the number of international students coming here, which to me is such a regressive move rather. And we can all see it in plain light of day how aggressive a move it is, but yet it's a bandwagon that plays politically on a very superficial level. So a lot of concern about that. I'm not quite sure what the next 10 years are going to look like as things start to shrink, as budgets shrink at the university, as people are laid off or new hires are not being made. I worry about the intellectual capital, cultural capital of the country when we start talking about shrinking and limiting and restricting number of people who we should be bringing into with wide open arms into this country to be educated and serving on into the future as citizens.
Yeah, and Noreen, I guess the other point that you're making is like obviously the demographic numbers make an argument for one thing, but I think the societal challenges that our nations and the world faces make an argument for something else.
Right.
That we don't need less education to solve some of these
Exactly.
societal problems. We actually still need a lot more technological education and a lot more humanistic education as well to deal with what's coming. So it's obviously I'm not celebrating this contraction that's going on right now, and
Right.
some of it I understand it rationally from a numbers point of view, but it doesn't mean that we can really afford to just kind of give up the infrastructure, give up the ghost on this thing, because the world, I mean, needs these universities.
Yeah.
And but it's shifting. I just saw some stat the other day in the United States. They're saying they don't have the real numbers yet, but they're saying international enrollments might be down by 20% in the United States
Yeah.
this year. That's a lot.
Well, same here. What's it like in Australia, Judith?
Caps as well.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a lot more political interference in higher education now too. Everybody feels it's not quite as bad as schools. In schools, because everybody's been to schools, they've got an opinion about what education in schools should be like.
Yeah.
It's not quite like that yet, but there is an increasingly amount of political interference, both in terms of what should be taught, who can be recruited, the size of universities. So what's your sense about and what can be talked about and what can't be talked about? So the silences are there as well. So what's your view about the politics and political interference in universities?
Well, it's certainly very real here, where the government funds about 73% of the university budget. So that gives them what they believe to be the moral authority to have as much interference as possible. It's a bit of a shell game or smoke and mirrors because they pretend not to be interfering. But when you live in a small community, everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows how that game of so-called not interference is actually working. It's working in lots of ways that people write about, actually, and know and share stories about at dinner parties, because we all know the people who are making those decisions and what their attitudes might be. I think goes back to something we were saying earlier about we didn't use a term, but it's a form of self-censorship that this kind of cultural climate generates, a kind of practice of keep your head down, do your job. Times are tough. Don't make noise. Don't make trouble. It's not going to get you anywhere. And that goes for faculty. Certainly, it's true for staff working in the trenches in the offices of the university, keeping the machine running. But it is and has always been surprising to me that as times get even tougher and that interference from government becomes more obvious, more conspicuous, that more and more people aren't, as they used to when I was an undergraduate, standing up, maybe not throwing bricks through buildings, but making a lot of noise and challenging it. You do have faculty associations and faculty unions, particularly in Canada, making those noises, but they are very much in opposition to the senior management of the university and administration. So you get divided houses running the universities. That is very good for government because they can just say, you sort it out. It's not our problem. And that's been pretty much the way that's been playing out for the last, I say, at least 15 years or so. And it's the self-censorship that really bugs me. I get it. But I wish, we have solidarity in numbers, but we're not taking advantage of that. And I understand that too. It takes a lot to do that in an environment, in a institutional environment where people can close their door to their office and get their head down on their papers and at their desk and do what they're doing. It takes more effort to and to work outside of that sense of order in the day-to-day of a university faculty researcher to make bigger noises or louder noises. But it's dispiriting. I know people care a lot about what's going on, but there's no cohesion to, let's call it, resistance to any of that.
Mm-hmm. Goldie, have you got any observations you'd like to make
on this? Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, it's explicit. There's explicit political attack right now on higher education in many facets. It's attacking some of the most fundamental values of American higher education, fundamental values about sort of, promoting diversity and equity in higher education. You can't say those. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are words that the government is now trying to actually prohibit, not just the words, but the actions, the efforts of schools to make their campuses more diverse, to make their campuses more equitable, and to make their campuses inclusive. These are all, making campuses more inclusive and welcoming to students of all backgrounds has been sort of a pillar of American education for the past 30 or 40 years. And our government now is, under the Trump administration, has been trying to sort of taking a whole frontal assault on that. So it's very explicit here. Interesting, I think. I mean, there have been examples of some of the institutions getting together to resist, like literally fight back with lawsuits. It's emboldened, I think, the faculty unions in many cases as well. As you were talking before, I was almost kind of wondering if in some way the university leadership might be, in a way, a little bit grateful to have these faculty unions now, especially the American Association of University Professors, which is an organization whose influence has kind of waxed and waned over the years. They've been pretty forthright in the last few months. Actually, just before getting on this call today, just realized that they put out a very strong statement just the other day in response to this so-called compact that the Trump administration has proposed to a few universities, offering them sort of special status if they'll agree to a bunch of restrictive policies that the government wants to put in place. And the AAUP has put out a very strong statement against that. So in a way, I mean, our political things are still shaking out. I don't know who's on, all the sides are still kind of dividing up. And obviously, as I said, 50 states, and every state is very different. So it's not like you can even talk about one uniform response to what's happening from the federal government. But I think there's been there has been resistance in some quarters, and I think we'll start to see a little bit more of it as people start to realize what's happening. But the politicization was happening already in some states before the Trump administration came along, and now it's obviously gotten it's almost become national policy, right. which is very different, I should say. I mean, I've been covering this stuff for a long time, and when Republicans come in, we have sort of one sort of set of values, and when the Democrats are in charge, there's a whole different set of values. This is something that's a whole level different than any of that. This is not just, we have a different political philosophy. This is something really fundamentally going after some of the, basic building blocks of American higher education. So we're in a very different time right now.
Yeah.
So we're just about out of time, and I've got one last question I'd like to ask you both. Imagine we're catching up again in 5 years' time. We'll still look the same, and we'll still be, equally spry and
no gray anywhere. Yeah.
What do you think we'll be talking about? What will be the issues you think that we're now sort of both insiders and outsiders of higher education? But what do you think the challenges facing higher education will be? Goldie, let's start with you, given that you're in front of me.
Okay, and I guess I don't feel particularly optimistic, but rather than curl up in a little ball and cry, I'll go with the optimistic one and just say I'm hoping that the conversation is about how the academy has been rebuilding, or how the academy will rebuild. I've actually talked to a few people in and around the sector who are saying right now they don't really know how to deal with what's coming at them right now. They're just hoping that there's some place there's an after, and they're trying to think about what will higher ed look like afterwards, and what will it need, what will the country look like afterwards, and what will it need. Like I said, this is a very optimistic point of view, because there's nothing that says this won't really spiral into something much worse than what we're seeing already, in my opinion. But so I'm hoping that that's the conversation. It's time for, let's have the reset. There's definitely things that have been wrong with American higher education that have been problems for the last 10, 15 years. Maybe in the course of this reset, some of that will get addressed as well. Maybe cost, maybe some new cost models, maybe some new attendance models, some new structures that make higher education more flexible. So hopefully that's, when I'm not in my little ball, curled up in my little ball, maybe that's the way hopefully that's the conversation we're having.
At least you're not in a dark room. Noreen.
Yeah, I think it's one fortuitous consequence of the pendulum swinging so far to the right in the US is, as you know, and it's kind of a commonly known story, is that Canadians are now kind of identifying themselves generally, broadly speaking, in opposition to that, and declaring much more solidarity with a more kind of liberal-minded and public-facing and public-engaging kind of ethics. And although universities are struggling with withdrawal of public fundings in many sectors, and in Western Canada that's more conservative, there is the same sort of DEI attacks going on. Broadly speaking, there's a majority support for a more liberal approach to governance and governing in this country. And I think, the worse things get, I'm afraid to say, in the US, the more solidarity there seems to be among Canadians. And we're all talking about that and acknowledging it all the time, and we can feel it. And it's given a kind of energy to conversations about marking difference and building a civic society that's fair-minded and in view of social justice, in a way that one is not allowed to talk about that, or one, again, is censoring oneself south of the border. So I think if things continue along this line, which they will for some time, at least for this administration, it might have a good knockoff effect on Canada. Goldie used the word flexible about higher education. Indeed, that is a benefit of this challenge that's happening to higher ed, that universities do need to figure out ways of being more flexible. I think of tying more work integrated learning into curriculum.
Yeah, definitely.
We've been so slow to do that. There's a movement in Canada that's federally funded to advance that, which is a very good sign. And that's robust. And I think in 5 years, we'll be talking much more commonly about that, not shrinking away from having those conversations about what we call WIL here. Yeah.
This nearly 1 hour conversation has gone very quickly, and we could probably continue on for another hour, but sadly we've got things to do with our day, and you've got things to do in your evening. Thank you both for really what I thought was a very generative, generous conversation, and I look forward to us having another conversation at some time. So thank you again.
Thank you. This was great.
Terrific. Great to talk to all of you. And yeah, let's do it again.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.